Hi, and welcome to Crash Course Catholicism, a podcast about Catholic teaching and why it makes sense. I'm your host, Caitlin West. Hey friends, and welcome to our 5th episode in this deep dive into the social doctrine of the Catholic Church. So, in our previous episodes, we've talked about the human person, the nature of the human person, and the different dimensions of the human person. And now in this episode, we're going to begin a discussion of human rights. What are human rights? Are they objective or are they subjective? Are they constructed by societies and legal systems? Or are they grounded in something deeper and more objective that transcends social constructs? So in this episode, we're going to think about what human rights are, what the nature of human rights are. And in our next episode, we're going to go through a list of different human rights that every person has. But before we get into that, I just want to take a moment to say thank you to the people who have become patrons of the podcast over the past month. Thank you so much. And thank you again to those people who have been supporting the podcast already. Because of your support, we've been able to begin a few really exciting projects. And these projects are going to kind of start coming to fruition over the next month or so. So if you are a member of Patreon, you're going to see over the next month some announcements and some kind of sneak peek previews of upcoming projects that we have, which is really exciting. Another thing that we have started doing for patrons is creating some additional content at the end of every episode. So things that, we didn't get a chance to discuss in the body of the episode itself, we're going to expand on in that additional content in every episode that will be uploaded to Patreon. So if you are someone who has been thinking about supporting the podcast financially, this is a fantastic time to do it because we're in a period of growth. We've got some really exciting things coming up, and your support will help us to make that happen better and faster. So thank you again to the people who are already patrons of the podcast. Thank you to the people who are praying for the podcast, even if you can't offer financial support. And to those who can and would like to, now would be a fantastic time to support the podcast, not just because it is incredibly helpful for us, but also because there's some exciting new content that's going to be available to you through Patreon. Okay, so with that said, let's now get into a discussion of human rights. So before we talk specifically about human rights, it might be worth defining what a right is in general. What actually is a right? So the Catholic Encyclopedia says that a right is a kind of moral or legal claim on something. So it says, when a person declares he has a right to a thing, he means that he has a kind of dominion over such thing, which others are obliged to recognize. Right may therefore be defined as a moral or legal authority to possess, claim, and use a thing as one's own. So a right means that I have a legitimate moral or legal claim on something which others are obliged to recognize. So for example, say that I get a job in a particular workplace and I sign a contract saying I'm going to do X amount of work and that you're going to pay me X amount of money in return. In that instance, I now have a legitimate claim to a certain wage from that organization. And the organization has a right to or a claim on my work for them. Okay, so a right is a moral or legal claim that others are obliged to recognize. And actually, that final point raises something that is important to bear in mind when we talk about rights, which is the fact that every right that we have comes with corresponding responsibilities. So in the case of a work contract, I have a right to a wage, but I also have the responsibility to do the work. And conversely, the organization has a right to my work, and it also has an obligation, a responsibility to pay me my wage. So we're going to go into that concept of responsibilities in greater detail later in the episode, but I think it's important to flag at the outset when we're defining what rights are, just to note that rights don't really function properly unless they go hand in hand with responsibilities that I have and that other people have. Okay, so we've said that a right is a moral or legal claim to something. So at this point, it might be helpful to distinguish between moral rights and legal rights, because they are two different things. I mean, they're definitely connected to each other, but they're not the same thing. So what is a moral right? A moral right is a legitimate claim that I have that is rooted in morality and in the natural law. So it is rooted in a deeper set of truths that transcends the kind of social constructs of the society that I live in. So as a human person, for instance, I have a moral right to life. And that moral right exists even if I live in a society that tells me that actually I don't have an inherent right to life, and that if I am, an unborn baby, or if I have a disability, or I'm an elderly person, maybe I don't have an inherent right to life anymore. So even if the legal system doesn't acknowledge that right, or doesn't honor it or uphold it, that moral right still exists. A legal right, on the other hand, is a kind of concrete expression of a moral right. So the Catholic Encyclopedia says that legal rights emanate from a law which assigns to one the dominion over the thing and imposes on others the obligation to respect this dominion. So a legal right is a kind of formal acknowledgement of my rights that imposes obligations on other people as well. Now, that distinction between moral and legal rights is an important one, because some people look at different societies around the world or throughout history, and they see that people's legal rights change depending on what society you live in or what time period you live in. So, for example, at certain points in history, women didn't have the legal right to vote. And at other points, they have been given that legal right to vote. So some people look at the changes in legal rights across time periods and cultures, and they come to the conclusion that all rights are basically just a social construct, right? The societies just make decisions about what people have a right to, and that those decisions dictate what my moral rights are. In reality, the Catholic Church teaches that it's the other way around. Moral rights exist and are objective no matter what time period we live in or what society we live in. Legal rights are an expression of my moral rights, and that expression of my moral rights may be accurate or inaccurate. So just because something is legal or not legal in a particular context, that doesn't necessarily mean that I don't have a moral right to that thing. So just because I'm not given the legal right to vote, that doesn't mean I don't have a moral right to vote. And conversely, just because I do have the legal right to something, that doesn't mean that I have a moral right to it. So for example, let's say I lived in a society where legally I have the right to amass as much wealth as I want and to hoard it and to keep it all for myself and not share it with anyone, and there's no taxation system, there's no redistribution of wealth. Legally, I have the absolute right to just accumulate and possess as much wealth as I want. Okay, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's morally justified. I may actually have a moral obligation to share my wealth with other people who need it, regardless of whether or not that moral right is being upheld in the legal system that I live in. Okay, so a moral right is something objective that is not socially constructed. A legal right is an expression of my moral rights, and that expression may be accurate or inaccurate. It's also worth noting that there are situations in which I might have a moral right, and the way that it's expressed, it's not that one country or one society is right and one is wrong, because they both express my rights in different ways. It's just that there might actually be some legitimate flexibility in terms of how that moral right is upheld. So, for example, as a human person, like we've said, I have the right to life, right? Which means that I have a right to remain safe and secure as I go about my daily life. Now, that is a moral principle that is true no matter where I live. However, different cultures might have different ways of expressing or systematizing that moral right to safety. So, for example, we could think about road rules. In some countries, legally, you are obliged to drive on the left-hand side of the road. In other countries, legally, you're obliged to drive on the right-hand side of the road. In that instance, there are two different expressions of my moral right to safety, and neither expression is objectively right or wrong. It's just that there's flexibility in terms of how that right is implemented. So differences in legal rights aren't necessarily always a problem, but it's important to note that legal rights don't always accurately express or honour the true moral rights of people. Okay, so that's a broad overview of rights as a category. Now, let's narrow in specifically on human rights. What are human rights? Human rights are rights that belong specifically to human beings, as opposed to other kinds of beings like animals. Human rights arise out of human nature. So in the last couple of episodes, we've been talking about what human nature is, okay, what a human person is. And those different facets of the human person, the fact that we have an intellect, that we have free will, that we have dignity, these truths and realities give rise to certain legitimate moral claims that I have. So because I have an intellect, I have a moral right to receive at least a basic education. And because I have dignity, then I have the moral right to be treated with dignity. So no one has the right to violate my human dignity by enslaving me, for instance. Now, because human rights arise out of human nature, and every human person has human nature, and there are certain things about the human person that are true of every human being, no matter who you are, what that means is that human rights belong to every single human being without exception, regardless of who they are, of where they live, what their abilities are, or how old they are. Human rights are not contextually dependent because they don't arise out of a particular legal system or social arrangement. They arise directly from human nature itself. In order to be able to express my humanity fully, there are certain things that we need as human beings and certain things that we have a genuine moral claim to. And when those things are denied or violated, that's not just like an inconvenience or an abstract sort of injustice. It is an attack, a direct attack on our human dignity. So point 153 of the Compendium of Social Doctrine says that the roots of human rights are to be found in the dignity that belongs to each human being. The ultimate source of human rights is not found in the mere will of human beings, in the reality of the state, in public powers, but in man himself and in God, his creator. So, if you've been following those previous episodes in this series, the discussion of human rights connects directly to what we've been saying about the human person and human dignity. Our rights are not arbitrary. They're not just a random list of things that societies have collectively decided to call rights. They are natural, objective, and inherent. They belong to every single person, not because any government or institution has granted them, but because of what every person fundamentally is. Human beings are rational, free, and made for truth and relationship. And for that reason, they require certain conditions in order to flourish. And those conditions are what we're referring to when we talk about human rights. So, the compendium names a few key attributes of human rights. It says, human rights are universal, inviolable, inalienable, and indivisible. So, let's go through each of those labels and think about what each of them means. So, human rights are universal, and that just means that everyone has them. So the compendium says that they are present in all human beings without exception of time, place, or subject. So 1,000 years ago, humans had the exact same fundamental human rights as they do now. And in 1,000 years from now, they will still have the exact same rights because human nature is what it is. So human rights are universal. They are also inviolable. So when the church says that human rights are inviolable, that means that they should not be violated. Okay, it means that there are certain rights that should never be broken or violated. There are things we can never do to a person because they would always directly attack their dignity. So, for example, we can never justify deliberately killing an innocent person or torturing someone or treating another person as if they have no worth or dignity. I think it was in our last episode, we gave the example of enslaving one person so that the rest of the world can flourish. Well, in that hypothetical situation, we wouldn't be justified in violating even that one person's rights. And even when it's for a good cause, we are never justified in violating the dignity of even a single human person. Now, of course, there are situations in which our human rights may be limited or restricted for legitimate reasons, particularly in the pursuit of justice or the common good. So, for example, if I were to commit a serious crime and be imprisoned, in that instance, my freedom, which is one of my human rights, my freedom is being curtailed. Even in that situation, though, I still would retain my dignity. So even though my freedom of movement might be limited, I still have freedom as a human being. So I should be allowed to have freedom of thought and religion. I still have the right to be treated humanely. So while there are situations where our rights need to be moderated or held in balance with the rights of others, what can never be justified is treating a person in a way that directly violates their dignity. Okay, so human rights are inviolable as well as being universal. Human rights are also inalienable. So inalienable means that those rights can never be taken or given away. So you could never do anything that would cause you to no longer have human rights. So even if you become ill or you acquire a disability or you're in a coma, there's nothing that you could do that would mean that you no longer have human rights. You remain a human person with a human nature and human dignity, and that dignity should always be upheld in the way that you are treated by other people. This also applies to people who have done something wrong, right? So if you are, let's say, a criminal and you commit a horrific crime, let's say you commit mass murder, you might look at that person and think, okay, well, what they have done is so horrific that it might justify us violating their dignity by, say, torturing them, for example. But actually, that's not the case. I mean, of course, justice is permissible. Like, we can put someone in prison if they've done the wrong thing. And punishment can be legitimate when it's carried out in a way that respects the dignity of that person and is ordered towards justice. But even when someone has done the worst thing possibly imaginable, they remain a human being with human rights that need to be upheld. So if we put a mass murderer in prison, that's fine. That's justice, right? We might need to do that for the safety of other people and in order to maintain justice. However, even in that situation, when we've imprisoned someone, we still need to treat them with basic human dignity. So that means keeping them in conditions that are not totally squalid and giving them food and drink, like giving them their basic fundamental rights that acknowledge the fact that they remain a human person with human dignity. The fact that rights are inalienable also means that they exist even when they are not formally recognised by the government or the people around you. So this is what we already talked about, that even if your rights are ignored or violated, that doesn't mean that they cease to exist. You still have rights on a moral level, even if no one is upholding them. Okay, and then the last attribute is indivisible. Human rights are indivisible, which means that every single one of them matters. We can never just isolate one right or one set of rights and forget about the others. So point 154 of the compendium says, human rights are to be defended not only individually, but also as a whole. Protecting them only partially would imply a kind of failure to recognise them. So in other words, it's not enough for us to just champion some human rights while neglecting others. And this is worth reflecting on because in practice, it can be quite easy to develop blind spots, to be genuinely passionate about certain human rights while not giving much thought to others. And this is just human nature, right? We tend to be drawn to the issues that are closest to us or that we feel the most strongly about, but we also need to be careful not to lose sight of the whole picture of human rights in that pursuit of the good things that matter the most to us. So, let's say, for example, that there was a political party that was doing a really, really good job of defending the right to life through their work on abortion and euthanasia. Now, that is genuinely important and a really good thing. However, if that same party was simultaneously failing to protect people's rights in other areas, say in the area of education or healthcare, then there's something not quite right there, right? That there is a failure to holistically and fully recognize human rights as a whole. Or we could say the same thing on the flip side. Like if a government was doing amazing work defending the right to housing or healthcare, but at the same time they were dismissing the right to life or the right to religious freedom, okay, that would also be insufficient. Defending some rights while overlooking or even violating others falls short of a true and holistic recognition of human rights. Now, it's important to note that indivisibility doesn't mean that every single right is equal in weight. So some rights, like the right to life, are more fundamental because they are the basis for all the other rights that we have, like the right to education and healthcare. However, indivisibility doesn't mean that we can simply defend one set of rights while completely ignoring the rest. A true acknowledgement of human rights acknowledges all of our rights and not just some of them. Okay, so those are the different sort of attributes of human rights. They are universal, inviolable, inalienable, and indivisible. Now, we've said earlier that every right has corresponding responsibilities. So this is something that's worth returning to and kind of expanding on in this discussion of human rights. So the Catholic Encyclopedia says, to the right of one person corresponds an obligation on the part of others, so that right and obligation condition each other. So in other words, there is just about no right that we could think of that doesn't also come with responsibilities, both on my part and on the part of others. If I have a right, then other people are required to acknowledge and uphold that right. And they might be required to do that passively, so by refraining from violating my rights, or they might be required to uphold my rights actively. They might be required to do something for me or give something to me in order to uphold my rights. So for example, we can return to the right to life, right? Every human person has a fundamental right to life. And that places responsibilities on other people. Some of those responsibilities are passive. So other people have the responsibility to just not kill me. That's a passive responsibility. But also there are other people in my life who might have active responsibilities towards me in order to uphold my right to life. So for example, my parents, when I'm a baby and I'm not capable of feeding myself or looking after myself, well, my parents have an active responsibility to actually keep me alive. They're required to feed me, to put clothes on my body, to keep me safe so that I stay alive. So every right comes with a set of responsibilities, and these responsibilities can be passive or they may require some active response on the part of the people around me. And actually, this is an area that we're going to expand on a little bit in our bonus material at the end of this episode, because it can raise some questions and people might say, well, okay, well, if you have a right that places demands on other people, then like, is that truly a right? Because how can you force other people to do things for you? Okay, we'll go into that more when we get to the bonus content at the end of the episode. But for now, let's return to this idea that every right has corresponding responsibilities. Now, if this is the case, that rights come with responsibilities, then that means that if I personally have a set of human rights, I also personally have a set of responsibilities towards other people. If I want to claim that I have rights, which I do have rights. If I want to claim that, then I also have to reckon with the fact that other people have rights too. And that means that I have obligations towards them. And if I were to ignore those obligations, then there would be something wrong there. So point 156 of the compendium says, those who claim their own rights, yet altogether forget or neglect to carry out their respective duties, are people who build with one hand and destroy with the other. So it's not enough for me to just champion my rights. I also need to acknowledge my personal responsibilities that come with each of those rights. So, for example, as a human person, I have the right to private property. And if that's true, then that means that's true for everyone. That means that other people also have the right to private property. So if I were to say, okay, I have the right to private property, so I'm just going to buy up every single house in my neighborhood because I can, and I have the right to private property. Okay, there's a obvious problem there, right? Because you're pushing your rights so far that you're actually violating the rights of other people because you're buying up all of the property available and now no one else can have their own private property. And obviously this is an exaggerated example, but it kind of gets the point across that if I have rights, then other people have those same rights. And that obliges me to also actively respect the rights of other people. It might mean that I have a moral responsibility to give some of my wealth to charity or to share some of the things that I own with people who need it. And this leads us to another important point, which is the fact that there are times when, as individuals, we are called on to freely renounce some of our rights for the sake of meeting our obligations to others. And this one can be a bit of a bitter pill to swallow, but it's something that the Catholic Church teaches. So for instance, Pope Paul VI writes that the more fortunate should renounce some of their rights so as to place their goods more generously at the service of others. So we can return to that example of private property. If I'm in a position of relative comfort and there are people around me who are in genuine need, then my moral obligations to those people should lead me to voluntarily set aside what I might otherwise spend on myself and instead direct those goods towards other people in need. Okay, so we've given an overview of what rights are in general, and then what human rights are specifically. We've talked about the relationship between rights and responsibilities. And then the natural question that follows from all of this is, what specifically are the rights that every human person has? What do human rights actually look like in practice? Well, the first thing to say is that the Catholic Church doesn't have a single comprehensive list of human rights. She doesn't have like her own formal declaration of human rights. However, she has consistently affirmed the value of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was proclaimed by the United Nations in 1948. So the Catholic Church has affirmed that this was an important landmark step in the recognition of the dignity of every human person. And we're not going to have time in this podcast to go through the whole United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but I would really recommend, if you have the chance, sitting down and reading it, because it's pretty amazing. And as you read through that Declaration of Human Rights, you can see how each of these human rights is rooted in everything we've been talking about the nature of the human person, like who we are as people gives rise to this list of rights. It's really amazing. So the Catholic Church has recognized the value of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as that throughout the writings of different popes and in the compendium of the social doctrine itself, the Catholic Church discusses a wide variety of specific human rights. So even though they're not all kind of gathered together in a single sort of list of like, these are human rights, the Catholic Church does talk about a whole range of human rights that arise out of our human nature. So that's what we're going to do in our next episode. We're going to get into these specifics. We're going to look at particular human rights that the Catholic Church identifies and reflects on, and think about how each of them arises directly out of the nature of the human person. Okay, great. Well, that's all we have time for today. Awesome. I can't wait to wrap up this conversation about human rights. Actually, the list of human rights is such fun. It's so fascinating. And it's amazing when you see the like relationship between human rights and human nature. And you're like, yeah, this really is not just constructed. This so logically arises out of like what we are as human beings. Anyway, I'm already getting excited about it and we haven't even gotten to that episode, but I can't wait. That'll be in a couple of weeks. Awesome stuff. Have a fantastic fortnight and I will talk to you later. Okay, bye.